History often tells stories of kings who were betrayed by enemies, but some of the most tragic and powerful stories are about kings who were betrayed by their own people. Imagine ruling an entire nation, trusting the crowds that cheer your name, only to one day realize those same voices are demanding your fall. Power can build empires, but betrayal from within destroys them faster than any foreign army ever could. These are the forgotten stories of rulers who didn't lose their thrones to outsiders, but to the very people they were supposed to protect. Our first story begins in ancient Rome with Julius Caesar, a man loved by the public but feared by the elite. Caesar was not officially called a king, but in reality he held king-like power. The Roman people admired him because he gave them land, food, and stability after years of civil war. He was seen as a hero, a leader who understood the struggles of ordinary citizens. Crowds celebrated him, statues were built in his honor, and his name became a symbol of hope for the poor. But behind the scenes, the Roman Senate believed Caesar was becoming too powerful. They feared he would end the Roman Republic and turn it into a monarchy, ending their political influence forever. The same senators who smiled in public meetings secretly planned his death. What makes this story even tragicer is that many of the conspirators were not enemies, but his closest friends and allies. The most famous among them was Brutus, a man Caesar trusted like a son. On March 15th, 44 BC, known as the Ides of March, Caesar walked into the Senate, completely unaware that he was walking into a trap. As he took his seat, the senators surrounded him, pretending to present a petition. Suddenly, knives were pulled out. Caesar was stabbed again and again by the very men he had protected and promoted. When he saw Brutus among them, it is said that he stopped resisting, realizing that even those closest to him had turned against him. Although the Senate claimed they killed Caesar to save the Republic, the people of Rome saw it as a betrayal. The same citizens who once cheered the senators now turned against them. Riots broke out, chaos spread through the city, and instead of saving Rome, Caesar's death led to even more bloodshed. In the end, the man who was betrayed became a legend, while the betrayers were remembered as traitors. Caesar's story teaches us a brutal truth about power. Sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from enemies outside the kingdom, but from the people sitting closest to the throne. And this pattern would repeat again and again throughout history, with kings trusting their people only to be destroyed by them. Another chilling tale of betrayal comes from King Richard II of England, a ruler whose downfall was orchestrated not by foreign invaders, but his own nobles and advisors. Richard ascended to the throne at just 10 years old, inheriting a kingdom that had experienced decades of political tension and unrest. For much of his reign, he struggled to assert control, often relying on favorites and courtiers to manage the affairs of state. While he dreamed of absolute power at a monarchy that answered only to him, many nobles felt increasingly alienated by his decisions. They saw his reliance on personal favorites as favoritism and a threat to their own influence. By the late 1990s, Richard's heavy-handed rule and extravagant lifestyle fueled resentment among those who were supposed to be his most loyal supporters. Discontent among the English nobility reached a tipping point when he attempted to confiscate lands and punish those who opposed him. The very men who owed their positions and wealth to the king's favor began plotting in secret. They whispered among themselves, formed alliances, and prepared to remove him from power, not through negotiation, but through a cold and calculated coup. In 1399, Richard was betrayed by Henry Bolingbroke, a cousin who had been exiled from England under Richard's orders. Bolingbroke returned with a small army, and instead of facing a united kingdom defending the throne, he found that Richard's own nobles abandoned him one by one. They refused to fight for their king, turning their loyalty to the man who promised them restoration of lands, titles, and influence. Richard, once a powerful and feared monarch, found himself isolated and powerless. Ultimately, Richard II was captured, imprisoned, and forced to abdicate in favor of Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. The betrayal cut deeper than a simple political maneuver. It shattered Richard personally, leaving him humiliated and alone, betrayed by the very people he had trusted to uphold his reign. He spent the remainder of his life in captivity, dying under mysterious circumstances. His story became a warning for future kings. A ruler can control armies and laws, but they cannot control the hearts of those closest to them. One of the most notorious betrayals in medieval history is that of King King Louis XVI of France, whose downfall marked the end of a centuries-old monarchy and the beginning of a revolutionary era. Unlike Caesar or Richard III, Louis's betrayal wasn't just by a few elites, it was by an entire nation that had once revered him. France in the late 18th century was a kingdom of extremes, immense wealth for the royal family and the nobility, and unbearable poverty for the majority of the population. For years, Louis attempted to balance tradition with reform, but his indecision and perceived detachment from the common people fueled resentment. The betrayal began slowly, with whispers of discontent growing into open rebellion. The people who had once supported the monarchy, the peasants, urban workers, and even some members of the middle class, turned against Louis. They saw him not as a benevolent king, but as a symbol of oppression, waste, and inequality. Even those closest to him, including some of his advisors and nobles who had historically protected his interests, began abandoning him under pressure from the rising revolutionary fervor. In 1789, the storming of the Bastille marked the turning point. The monarchy's enemies were no longer hidden. They were in the streets, in homes, and in the halls of power. Louis and his queen, Marie Antoinette, were increasingly isolated, betrayed not by one individual, but by a nation that had once pledged loyalty. Attempts to negotiate, to calm the unrest, or to escape were met with failure, largely because many within his court were secretly aiding the revolutionaries. By 1792, Louis XVI had been stripped of most of his authority, imprisoned, and subjected to a trial that ended in his conviction for treason. On January 21st, 1793, he was executed by guillotine in front of thousands of citizens, people he had once ruled and who had once promised allegiance. What made this betrayal so devastating was its scope. It wasn't just a single conspirator or rival. It was the betrayal of an entire society, a complete reversal of loyalty by those who were supposed to uphold the monarchy. Louis XVI's story is a grim reminder that betrayal can be systemic. It teaches that a king or any leader cannot rely solely on tradition or inherited loyalty. When trust erodes across a population, even the mightiest ruler can fall. The people who once cheered for you can become the very ones who demand your end, and history is filled with the echoes of their collective betrayal. Another haunting example of betrayal comes from King Charles I of England, whose life and reign were torn apart by the very people he considered his subjects and, in many cases, his closest allies. Charles inherited the throne in 25, a time of deep political and religious tension. Determined to rule with strong authority, he often clashed with Parliament, believing that the divine right of kings gave him unquestionable power. But this belief, instead of solidifying his reign, created suspicion, resentment, and ultimately rebellion. Charles faced a betrayal that divided an entire country. His own soldiers, advisors, and nobles who should have protected him and enforced his laws began to question his leadership. The conflict escalated into the English Civil War, pitting the king's forces, known as the Royalists, against the parliamentarians who felt justified in resisting what they saw as tyranny. Even within his inner circle, men he trusted with counsel and command betrayed him, either by defecting to the other side or by undermining his strategies. Charles's personal life also became entangled in political betrayal. He struggled with those closest to him, his queen, advisors, and family members, who could not stop the erosion of his authority. Promises of loyalty crumbled as fear and ambition overtook personal fidelity. When he was finally captured in 1647, his situation was utterly hopeless. The people who owed their positions, privileges, and even lives to the king now treated him as a prisoner, plotting the end of his reign. In 1649, Charles I was tried, convicted of high treason, and publicly executed. His execution sent shockwaves throughout Europe. A king, chosen by God in the minds of many, had been betrayed and condemned by his own people. This wasn't just political treachery, it was the ultimate personal betrayal. The very nation he had been sworn to rule turned against him, proving that even divine right could not protect a monarch from the consequences of widespread distrust and rebellion. Charles's story underscores a painful truth. Betrayal is rarely the result of a single act. It often grows from years of discontent, broken promises, and ignored grievances. A king may have power, armies, and wealth, but if trust erodes among the people who serve him, that power becomes meaningless. History is littered with stories such as these, each teaching the same lesson. Absolute authority can be shattered by betrayal from within. Finally, we come to the tragic tale of of King Gustav III of Sweden, a monarch whose ambition and reforms ultimately led to his betrayal and death at the hands of those he trusted most. Gustav III came to the throne in 1771 during a period of political instability. Determined to strengthen royal power and modernize his country, he introduced sweeping reforms, limiting the influence of the nobility, strengthening the monarchy, and promoting cultural and social progress. While these changes were praised by the public, they enraged the nobles, whose privileges and influence were being systematically curtailed. The betrayal did not come from a foreign army or an external threat, but from the very courtiers and nobles who surrounded Gustav in his own palace. Resentment festered quietly, hidden behind smiles and formal greetings. The king, confident in his ability to manage his court and enforce loyalty, underestimated the depths of their anger. In 1792, during a masked ball at the Royal Opera House in Stockholm, the conspirators struck. Gustav was shot in the back by one of the nobles, a bullet meant to end his life and his reforms. Even in his final hours, Gustav's betrayal was personal. Many of those involved were men he had promoted, trusted, and protected. Some were lifelong acquaintances, friends of his family, and loyal advisors whose allegiance he believed was unwavering. Their betrayal was not just political, it was a profound personal treachery that stunned Sweden and echoed across Europe. Gustav III died days later from his wounds, leaving behind a kingdom forever changed by the consequences of betrayal from within. Gustav III's death highlights the harsh reality faced by many kings. Ruling is not just about defending against enemies outside the walls of your palace, but navigating the hidden ambitions, jealousy, and resentment inside it. History shows that the most dangerous threat to power is often not the enemy who declares war, but the friend who smiles while planning your fall. From Caesar to Gustav III, these stories of betrayed kings remind us that loyalty is fragile, trust is precious, and the crown can feel heavier when those closest to you secretly wish to see it fall. The lesson from these tales is timeless. Leadership is as much about understanding hearts and intentions as it is about commanding armies and issuing decrees. Betrayal, especially from within, can undo even the strongest kingdoms, and the echoes of such treachery resonate far beyond the deaths of the rulers themselves. Beyond individual stories, the theme of kings betrayed by their own people reveals a recurring pattern throughout history. The closer the betrayer, the sharper the fall. From Caesar to Gustav III, these rulers share one tragic commonality. They all placed trust in those who were meant to support and protect them, only to have that trust weaponized against them. These betrayals were rarely impulsive. They were calculated, often years in the making, fueled by ambition, resentment, or fear. The king who believed in the loyalty of his inner circle often found that those loyalties were conditional, dependent on wealth, influence, or personal gain. Take the example of Edward II of England, whose downfall mirrors this same dangerous pattern. Edward II struggled to assert his authority over powerful nobles who resented his favoritism towards certain courtiers. Among those he trusted most were men whose loyalty wavered with political tides. Eventually, his wife and her allies orchestrated his imprisonment and eventual murder. Edward's story, like so many others, shows that betrayal is not always loud or dramatic. It can be subtle, a slow erosion of support until the king stands isolated, vulnerable, and powerless. What makes these stories resonate through centuries is the human element. Kings were not just rulers, they were fathers, husbands, and friends. Betrayal cut deeper because it came from those whose love or allegiance they believed was steadfast. The tragedy lies not only in the loss of power or life, but in the shattering realization that the people you trust most can become the instrument of your destruction. These accounts are more than historical anecdotes. They serve as lessons on the fragility of power and the complexity of human relationships. They remind us that loyalty cannot be assumed, and that even absolute authority cannot force the hearts of others. The crown, no matter how heavy or resplendent, carries an invisible danger, the silent ambitions and secret grievances of those who serve beneath it. In reflecting on these betrayals, we see a universal truth. Trust is the most powerful currency a leader can possess, but also the most perilous. Kings may fall to armies, revolutions, or conspiracies, but the most devastating falls are often those orchestrated by the very people who swore to protect them. History, in its relentless way, keeps repeating this lesson, leaving us to ponder the delicate balance between power, loyalty, and the human desire for influence. This brings the stories of these betrayed kings full circle, reminding us that no matter how secure a throne may seem, the real danger often lies in the hearts closest to it. Even beyond individual monarchs, history is filled with subtle betrayals that never reached the dramatic heights of assassinations or executions, but were equally devastating. Consider Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, the last emperor of the Romanov dynasty. Nicholas ruled a massive empire that spanned Europe and Asia, yet he was utterly unprepared for the political, social, and economic pressures of the 20th century. The Russian people once revered the Tsar as a semi-divine figure, believing his authority was ordained by God. Yet over time, discontent grew, not just among peasants, workers, and soldiers, but within Nicholas's own government and military advisors. During the Russian Revolution of 1917, Nicholas faced betrayal on multiple levels. Generals and ministers who had sworn loyalty began ignoring his commands or secretly negotiating with revolutionaries. Even his own family's attempts to guide him towards better decision-making were ignored, and he was increasingly isolated. By the time the Bolsheviks took power, Nicholas found himself powerless, betrayed not by a single enemy, but by a combination of incompetence, political maneuvering, and the withdrawal of support from those closest to him. He and his family were ultimately executed in 1918, marking the violent end of centuries of Romanov rule. What makes Nicholas II's story particularly haunting is the combination of naivety and misplaced trust. He genuinely believed in the loyalty of his inner circle, yet those around him prioritized survival, ambition, or ideology over fidelity to the crown. In many ways, Nicholas's fate mirrors the fate of kings like Charles I or Gustav III. The throne offers no protection when the people, and sometimes even friends and family, choose betrayal over allegiance. These narratives teach us that betrayal is rarely sudden. It often grows quietly, like a shadow over a kingdom. A king or leader may sense discontent, yet underestimate its depth, dismissing warnings until it is too late. Trust, once broken, cannot be restored, and history shows us repeatedly that the most catastrophic acts of treachery come from those who were once closest to the ruler. Ultimately, these stories are timeless lessons on human nature and power. Kings may command armies, issue laws, and control wealth, but they cannot command loyalty. The most dangerous enemies are not those at the gates. They are the ones standing behind them, smiling, whispering, and waiting for the moment to strike. The betrayal of kings by their own people is a sobering reminder that power is fragile, and trust, once broken, can destroy even the mightiest of rulers.